The one thing that pretty much all the startups have to go through, regardless of what industry they're in or what kind of problem they're solving, is fundraising. And yes, experienced founders with previous successes are for the most part no exception to this either, because, well, it's always smarter to risk someone else's money than your own, and luckily for us, venture funds exist precisely for this reason. You see, institutional investors are well aware that the majority of startups they invest in will likely fail, but every once in a while, a mule comes along and eventually that mule turns into a unicorn. A unicorn that makes up for all their losses and then some. And the more mules you invest in, the higher the chance that one of them will become a unicorn. And every mule's journey to becoming a unicorn starts with a pitch deck. Hey, if you're new here, hi, my name is Tomasz and I come from a tiny country in the heart of Europe called Slovenia. Me and my co-founder Aljaž are building an open source router completely from scratch, and I'm doing my best to share the whole story here on YouTube. We've raised $300,000 for this project earlier this year, and these funds went towards the development of our 10 gigabit router, which is currently in prototype production. But while we wait, we figured, you know what, let's spend this time preparing the documentation for our next round of funding, which will hopefully happen sometime in the next couple of months. And as I said in the intro, the process starts with a pitch deck, which is why we're going to divide this video into 3 parts. First, I'll give you the raw pitch I prepared for our investors, and when I say raw, I mean exactly as I plan to deliver it to investors, pretty much word for word, and I'll use it both for the ones I talk to in person as well as the ones I talk to online. In the second part, we will then dissect the pitch, and it's here where I will explain every slide more into detail and also provide the reason as to why it had to be included in the first place. And for the third part, I will show you the results of the router survey we put out in the previous video, because I think there's a couple of really interesting findings that, luckily for us, strongly support what we've been preaching on this channel all along. Ready for the pitch? Let's go. In early 2020s, I was lucky enough to be upgraded from my slow and not very reliable cable internet connection to the technology that many people worldwide still dream to this day, and that technology is a gigabit fiber optic internet. Alongside, obviously, the provider also replaced the router for something more modern. But the truth is, I hated that device from the very moment I laid my eyes on it. I mean, don't get me wrong, it did work just fine, and the fact that it looked like it was pulled straight out of a 70s sci-fi movie wasn't even its biggest offense. Nope, its biggest offense was running an operating system I didn't have full control over, and additionally didn't support features I considered to be mandatory. Now, obviously, because of the type of person that I am, I couldn't just let it go, so I asked customer support whether I'd be able to provide my own router, to which they said yes, but I'd still need to use their device in what is called a bridge mode. Well, needless to say that was completely unacceptable, so I spent about 3 months trying to hack into the device to see what the bridge mode even does and whether I would be able to circumvent it. I guess my stubbornness paid off, because I eventually not only succeeded, but managed to completely get rid of any traces of my ISP provided networking gear. Now, luckily for me, I do have this YouTube channel, and upon my sharing this story with my audience, something started to click. Even more so because it seems to have resonated with millions of people worldwide. In fact, that video has, to this day, garnered more than 1.5 million views and more than 3,000 comments, many of which by people that share my frustration with the ISP provided routers. During this undertaking, I was also trying to dip my toes into mechanical keyboards, because I was not quite satisfied with the offerings at the time, and since I needed someone to help me out with the PCB design, a common friend introduced me to Aljaž Titorić, an electrotechnical engineer who worked at ASML at the time. Now, if you're not familiar, ASML is a Dutch company that designs and manufactures the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that make pretty much all the modern CPUs that we know and use today. And while Aljaž was working on the PCB for my keyboard, I had one final objective for my home router, and that objective was to make it look nicer. You see, high-performance routers, the ones you most commonly find in racks of business IT rooms, for the most part have no focus on their visual design, which meant that if I wanted to have something that looks nice, as well as being very powerful obviously, then I'd have to do it myself. So I booted my Fusion 360 and designed a case that would be milled out of a solid block of aluminum, sent it over to my friend who owns a CNC machine and made a prototype. Now, at first I didn't plan this to go anywhere really, but decided to share it on Reddit anyway. And boy am I glad I did, because the very next morning I woke up to thousands of upvotes, hundreds of comments, and even a couple of people reaching out to me directly, all saying the same exact thing: if you make it, I'll buy it. And this, dear investor, was the spark, you could say, that made me apply for a local hardware incubator, and with each step I made and shared on my YouTube channel, more people started to tune in with not only interest, but eagerness to either provide help, support, and even money. This resulted in us raising $300,000 for our pre-seed round, which was just enough to be able to develop our first prototypes. But all these people, which I dare to call my community at this point, had one request. They, much like me, prefer to have full control over their devices, which means that the router we're making has to be open source. And luckily for me, I have about 10 years worth of experience of not only running, but also successfully exiting a business in the WordPress ecosystem. And WordPress, in case you didn't know, powers more than 43% of all the websites as of end of 2024. And not only does our router need to be open source, it also needs to be secure, reliable, durable, well documented, well supported, and finally well designed, both in terms of the physical device itself as well as the user interface that you'll use to interact with it. And it's not just me that feels the need for a device like this. You see, we've done a survey, and it turns out only 12% of respondents are happy with the router that was given to them by their ISP, and if they have the technical know-how to move to something of their own choosing, their satisfaction improves dramatically. Additionally, we've also done quite a lot of market research, and when it comes to home routers, and counting only the EU, UK and the USA, the number of households that use any kind of broadband internet access amounts to more than 350 million. Which means that in order to earn our first billion, we'd have to sell only 5 million devices, or in other words, would have to capture roughly 1.4% of the total addressable market. Speaking of the market, in order to successfully launch our device, we already have a plan that's been set in motion by the pre-seed round, but in order to follow through with it, we'd need to raise approximately $2.5 million in the round I'm pitching for. This amount will help us not only turn prototypes that are currently in production into evaluation boards that actually many are eagerly waiting for, but also certify the device for mass production and finally build a solid foundation for a market of happy customers that proudly show off their home router rather than hide it. Thank you. Now, before we go through each slide of my presentation and talk about it more in detail, let's first talk about the things that are not in there. And that's actually no coincidence. For example, there's no mention of 10 gigabit ports, or any kind of ports for that matter. There's no mention of hardware specs, performance, nothing of the sorts, and there's a reason for that. You see, those are features, and while they are certainly the easiest thing to talk about for a nerd like me, investors don't really care about them. Because features don't really set us apart from everyone else in any meaningful way. But before I tell you what does set us apart, let's start at the beginning of the pitch. As you might have noticed, I start with a once upon a time type of approach, and that's on purpose. When pitching, the default mode most resort to is discussing every slide individually, but that not only feels very unnatural, but also gets very boring very fast. What I've done instead is I told a story, and since humanity has used stories to pass information along, well, since forever, we break some, if not all, the monotony by going down the story route, and as an added benefit, we make the recipient, well, more receptive to towards the message we're trying to convey. And this message starts with my frustration, one that is shared by many people that receive or are even forced to use a router provided by their ISP. And frustration is a very powerful emotion when it comes to purchasing decisions, and also one that is very easy to share. I mean, just look at the comments in my previous video in which I'm asking for the one thing that people hate the most, and you'll see what I mean. And to further emphasize this frustration, I also share my most viewed video on the channel because I believe it was this very video that confirmed to me that a lot of people out there share my pain and care enough about it to pour the outrage in the comment section. In the next slide, I show my keyboard that I've built from the ground up to show the investors that I do have the skills and experience when it comes to developing physical products. And I also introduce Aljaž, my co-founder, and while at it, also share his credentials that are nothing short of top tier. I do this because in the past I did stumble upon investors that shied away from single founder companies. The reason being that if you can't find a single person that believes in your vision, then you'll have even a harder time convincing your target market. I mean, don't get me wrong, I didn't bring Aljaž for the ride for this reason, and trust me when I tell you that he believes in our project as much as I do. I'm just sharing it to let you know that investors like this do exist. The next slide, so the enclosure video also exists for two reasons. First, to further emphasize my know-how when it comes to designing a networking case this time, as well as to show a possible sales channel for our device going forward. And I don't mean Reddit specifically, but social media in general. I've been playing this game for a while, so you could say I know my way around here, and I think this channel and all of you beautiful viewers out there strengthen that notion even further. This episode is brought to you by PCBWay. I've been working with them on my custom keyboard project and I was super impressed with their speed, quality and price, so I'm more than happy to recommend them to anyone who needs any kind of PCB manufacturing done, whether it's just for a couple of prototypes or if you need a larger production run. Link to their website, of course, down in the description. Back to the video. Speaking of which, it was this channel that I think made it all possible, which is why I showed the next two slides. So the channel growth from the point I started to share this journey, and also the $300,000 we've raised as a direct consequence. And at this point, I need to thank all of you for not only sticking around, but also providing all the feedback we needed to shape what I think is the most important point of not just our pitch deck, but any pitch deck really, and that point is called Unique Value Proposition, or UVP. UVP answers one question and one question only. Why you? What is it that makes your product unique? What makes your product stand out among the competition? And why would someone choose your product over your competitors' products? And it's here where many founders make a cardinal sin when it comes to presenting their UVP. They think they are either way above everybody else or that the competition simply doesn't exist. And this is where they lose investors, because in this day and age, unless you're in some very, very specific niche, then you do have competitors, and saying you don't only shows that you haven't done enough homework. So what is our unique value proposition? Well, first, I'd say that nobody has attempted to make a fully open source router based on Linux that can be provided by the ISPs to their end customers. And second, no other networking gear founder has a presence on YouTube like I do. And I don't want you to take this as a bragging point, but I strongly believe what I've been saying all along, it's not a me project, it's an us project. And I have no doubt in my mind that you'll continue to support this project once we have more tangible stuff to do, such as contributing documentation, code, guidance, feedback, everything that a community does when they come together on a project they care about. And that's exactly why I also mentioned WordPress in this slide. Now, current issues that are going on in the WordPress ecosystem aside, I strongly believe that when it comes to its community, a lot of principles that work there could be easily applied to not only the device that we've been developing so far, but also to our business as a whole going forward. And speaking of business, I also mentioned my successful exit here because, as a surprise to no one, investors tend to favor founders that have already proven themselves in the past, and well, I think it would be foolish not to mention that here. Now, apart from our unique value proposition, it also makes sense to share our vision, which is what the next slide is for. If I was pressed for time, then this slide would actually be the very first one to go, because I do believe it's the weakest one of the bunch, since you could easily put it into any kind of hardware-related pitch deck and it would likely still hold up just fine. However, that doesn't mean that I don't believe what it says. Actually, it's quite the opposite. I strongly believe in these words and will stand behind them no matter what. And luckily for me, I have all of you to hold me accountable. Who was it that said that YouTube isn't a life changer? In more ways than one actually, because it was you who participated in the survey that we've put out last week, and the key takeaway here, judging by around 1,000 responses as of making this video, is that only 12% would recommend their ISP provided router to their friend. 12%! These numbers, which we will go more into details in the next part of the video, clearly show that people crave something better, and the problem we're solving is not an imaginary one, but one that's actually quite a universal source of frustration for tech-savvy folks around the globe. How many people exactly? Well, we've done a lot of reading on the topic, and if we only count the US, UK and the EU, then the total number of households with broadband internet come to around 350 million. And that is actually great news, because it gives us a number that is called TAM, or Total Addressable Market. We decided to focus on the number of households rather than a monetary number in terms of market size, and the reason for that is that the price of routers varies so significantly that it wouldn't make sense to paint this picture with such a broad stroke. And the best part? The 1.5% number that I'm referring to falls well into the TAM/SAM/SOM diagram, meaning it's not just a number we wish was achievable, but is small enough that we strongly believe we actually can. And speaking about numbers, the number that we can control is our margin. And while we haven't calculated an exact number yet, 200 profit per device of this class we think is a reasonable one for the purposes of this presentation, and it also serves as a good anchor point to show that indeed, in order to make our first billion, we need to sell 5 million routers. And even if we lower the margins, say to half of that, so $100 per device, then we'd need to double the amount of units sold, which then comes to just shy of 3% of our total addressable market. And why is that relevant? Well, because it turns out that if for some reason the majority of our target market prefer the cheaper device, then we'd be able to make one. Granted, we would make less per unit, yes, but we would still be able to achieve $1 billion worth of revenue. Call it a plan B, in a way. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Wow, you really went above and beyond with that number, Tomasz, but the reality is, if you want to raise big, you have to dream big, talk big, and walk big. Even more so because on the last slide we're asking for some serious money, and potential investors need to know that the market that we're addressing is big enough that they will, when all is said and done, make a solid return on their investment, which is, well, why they're investing in the first place. So how do we get to the $2.5 million that we want to raise? Well, we sat down with the team, and when I say team, I mean Aljaž and 3 other guys that help us out with the project but wish to remain anonymous for the time being. And we discussed what we think is needed to get to, a stable business of manufacturing and selling networking gear that many people enjoy using. We've decided that end of 2026 should be the deadline for that, which means we wrote down pretty much all 2 years worth of costs associated with us getting there, by far the biggest of which are of course salaries, because let's face it, highly skilled engineers that this kind of work requires don't come cheap. And we'll need quite a few of them, such as 1 to 2 Linux experts, 1 or 2 networking experts, an API developer, a front-end developer, someone to take care of the website, and so on and so forth. All these people will of course need an office to work in and a computer to work on. Now, of course we won't go full pedal to the metal day one, and we will go much more into details when it comes to our financial plan in one of the future videos, but for the purposes of this pitch it's good enough, because remember, The deck is only the beginning of the fundraising process and only needs to pique the interest of potential investors just enough to make them want to discuss the matter further. Now, one thing that many of you are probably asking yourselves here is, why am I focusing so much on ISPs in the first place? Well, the answer to that is actually quite simple. I love each and every one of you who watch my videos. I really do. Even more so because you just clicked that like button, right? But the fact of the matter is, you all belong in the first two groups in the tech adoption lifecycle, called innovators and early adopters. It's you guys I have to thank for pretty much everything we've achieved so far, but to take the whole project to the next level, we need to attack a much larger market and hopefully also a B2B business model. And here we have to reach out and pitch initially to smaller ISPs that are willing to take a risk with us, and later on, hopefully, also land some of the bigger ones. I mean, I'm not trying to fool myself into believing it will be easy, because it definitely won't be. But as they say, fortune favors the bold, and we're nothing if not bold. Okay, recap time. For a pitch deck to be considered successful, it needs to deliver the following information to whoever is on the receiving end of it, which in our case are our potential investors. In no particular order, because it doesn't really matter that much. As long as it tells a compelling story, we need to let them know the following: what problem we're solving, how are we solving it, what makes our solution unique, who are going to solve the problem for, who are the people behind the solution, how are we gonna make money, how much money we need in order to get there, and why, and last but not least, how much time do we need in order to achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves. Let's go ahead now and take a look at some numbers from the survey that's still up, by the way, so feel free to click the link in the description to fill it out. If you intend to, I'd actually advise you to do so before you watch this part, because doing it after will likely introduce some bias into your thought process, which is what we want to avoid, to get as clean data set as possible. So let's go question by question and discuss the result, starting by what you all use. Unsurprisingly, because people that watched my content are more tech savvy, by far the most used routing software is open source, so OpenWRT, OpenSense and pfSense. The only system that's not open source here is Ubiquiti, but before we get to the slide that explains why, let me mention the outlier that surprised me the most here, and that's viOS. Given how many comments I get asking whether our device will support it, I seriously expected this number to be much higher than it actually is. Just goes to show that in order to see the full picture, one needs both the qualitative and quantitative data. Now, before we continue, keep this chart in mind because it will be used as the context for all the ones that follow in a way. For example, when it comes to whether people would recommend whatever interface ASUS routers come with, more than 50% of you said you'd recommend it to your friends, which puts it next to all the big players in a manner of speaking. But given that out of 1,000 people only 25 of you use it, that boils down to around 13 who would actually recommend it. See? I told you context matters. Even more so if we look at the result of our second question. So how would people rate their overall satisfaction with the router operating system that they're using? By looking at these numbers alone, you'd easily be fooled into thinking that the vast majority of people actually enjoy what they currently have. Well, they do enjoy it, but that's not the full picture. Because if we look at the next question, so how many people would recommend their router to their friends, then you'll see that they enjoy it because they have something other than what their ISP provided. Like literally anything they choose themselves is an improvement. Performance of the interface next, and it's actually much of the same. Your most popular open source solutions being the more performant ones, and similar results with the documentation when it comes to UI. The one surprise at this chart, at least to me, is Ubiquiti, because, well, there is no documentation, but it appears that to many of you, the relative ease of use of the interface somewhat makes up for it. Interestingly enough, none of the solutions scored above 4, which means that there's definitely plenty of room for improvement. Well, across the board. And while speaking about surprises, the easiest to set up seems to be Fritz OS, and I, having owned one, can actually confirm that. However, again, context matters, and for me, the ISP already configured it for your typical, or should I say, basic home use case, and if I didn't require any of the, let's call it, non-basic features, then I'd probably never need to touch it in the first place. Which brings us to the last chart, and that's the update frequency. While it does vary from vendor to vendor, 23% of you said you immediately update your firmware whenever a new version comes out, and 40% of you said that you're aware of the updates but are not in any kind of hurry to update. And I guess to no one's surprise at this point, more than 50% of people that use ISP routers don't even bother updating. Like, at all. Okay, this is all the data we decided makes sense to convert into charts and present in this video. But additionally, we also fed your responses to ChatGPT, which produced this 10 plus pages long document, which shows what features you find useful, what features you wish were supported by your device but are not, how many of you integrated your routers into your smart home, and so on and so forth. We won't go through all these answers individually, as this video is already long enough as it is, but if you want to have a look yourself, we created a Google Doc with this report, which you can find in the video description, and if you have any kind of questions, fire them off in the comment section down below. Tomasz from Slovenia, signing out.